As we live with the Torah teaching, as we live with the Parsha each day, so there are messages for all of us, wherever we might be. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is welcome everybody. It's great to see you guys. I hope everyone's doing well. Ray, welcome. Max, welcome. Joy, welcome. Stan, welcome. Donna, welcome. Charna, welcome. Stephanie, welcome. A great Power Parsha welcome to you all. Okay, this week's Torah portion is Emor. We do not have a double portion this week, so it's just the one. And it's got a lot of really fantastic topics to explore. We're going to get through hopefully 3 points today that I wanted to share with you. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what I see. Okay, Torah portion is Emor, Leviticus chapter 21, and it opens with instructions regarding the Kohanim, regarding the priests. Of course, as we know, there are 3 categories of Jews, right? 3 categories of Jews, which sounds like the opening for a joke, but not a joke. There are the Kohanim, the priests, the Leviim, the Levites, and the Yisraelim, the Israelites. What distinguishes one category from the next? So let's start from, let's say, the bottom down, so to speak. The Israelites are basically referring to any Jew that comes from the tribes other than the tribe of Levi. So there are 12 tribes. One of them is the tribe of Levi, the Levite tribe, and that is, we'll leave that for a moment, but the other 11 tribes, all of those folks are Israelites. If you come from the tribe of Levi, if you're a Levite, well, if you come from the tribe of Levi, you might be a Levite or a Kohen. You might be a Levite or a priest. What determines what? So those that descended from Moses are Levites. Those that descended from Aaron are priests. So if you know a Kohen, anyone whose name is Kohen, assuming that the lineage is true, so that person is coming from Aaron. And if you know a Levite, someone who's a Levi, then they're coming from Moses. So here at the opening of Leviticus chapter 21, the beginning of our Torah portion, Emor, God says to Moses, take a look at this first verse, let's read it together. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, speak to the Kohen, the sons of Aaron, his brother, and say to them, let none of you defile himself for a dead person among his people. And here we encounter the Torah's laws of ritual or personal sanctity for the priests. The priests were meant to be a holy tribe, we're all holy, right? Every person is holy, but the Kohanim, the priests, were meant to be even holier. And when I say even holier, what I mean is they have to conduct themselves in a very, very special way. And that means not coming into contact with forms of ritual impurity. We've talked about ritual impurity in the last few weeks in various contexts. There are various things that would render someone impure, the most serious of which was coming in contact with a dead body. And so here, there's a Torah prohibition for the Kohen, against the Kohen coming into contact with a corpse, with a dead body. Except, verse number 2, except for his relative who was close to him. His mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother. Number 3, and for his virgin sister who is close to him, who is not yet with a man, for her he shall defile himself. In other words, if the sister's already married and has a family, so then she already has her own family and she has her own, whatever. So there's a little bit of a separation there on some level according to this line of reasoning for Torah. But the other, either an unmarried sister or the other relatives, mother, father, son, daughter, brother, so if they pass away, God forbid, then the Kohen is allowed to be at the funeral and is allowed to be in contact with the dead body, with the corpse of a loved one. This is a mitzvah, the mitzvah of ritual purity and staying away from a corpse that Kohanim practice to this very day. Someone who is a Kohen to this very day will avoid going to cemeteries in order to not become impure. Now, you have to understand how incredible that is. Because today, right now, we don't have a temple, a holy temple. And the whole issue of ritual impurity was that if you're impure, then you can't serve in the temple. Or you can't go to the temple if you're impure. And today we don't have a temple, so you would think all bets are off. Like, who cares? Go to a funeral, go to a cemetery, and that's it. It doesn't matter. There's no temple. And yet, for the last 2,000 years, Kohanim, even without a temple, Kohanim priests will be very careful to not, offhandedly just go to cemeteries and become in contact with dead bodies. Why? Because of the personal sanctity and the belief that at any moment Mashiach will come and we'll have a third temple, and you got to be ready to roll. So we have to stay away from impurity, even if it's not going to be practiced in a practical fashion. The idea here is that a Kohen should be careful about areas coming in contact with ritual impurity. So that's the opening mitzvah. Now, if you look at the opening verse, it says a double expression. I'm going to highlight it. You should be able to see the highlight that I just did. Speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and say to them. That seems a bit redundant, right? Speak to the Kohanim and say to them. Yeah, if you're speaking to them, then you're... Oh, wow, hold on one second before we get to this. Mark Galt just texted me. B'nai Zion's private cemetery in Chattanooga, where Mark is from, Chattanooga, Tennessee, has a driveway down the side. Now wait, is that for the Kohanim? Yes, for a Kohen. For a Kohen, that's how the Kohanim in Chattanooga would be able to visit the cemetery. They had an area that you can drive that wasn't right next to the graves. And that's how the Kohanim could go. That's amazing. That's amazing. Again, to this very day, cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, are built out or constructed, designed in a way that is Kohen friendly. Because Kohanim to this very day try to avoid direct contact with grave sites. By the way, it's an interesting topic in halacha because, even if you're under the same roof as someone who's deceased, that could be problematic. That could render a person impure, which means that Kohanim sometimes avoid even going to a hospital. Because if you're in a hospital, the odds are that there might be, a dead body inside the hospital at any given moment, and you're under the same roof. So I know some people, Kohanim, try to minimize. Look, we all try to minimize going to the hospital, right? No one wants to get sick, but I mean even visiting. So, but again, you got to be practical also, right? So the Torah does allow, when it comes to close relatives, to come in contact with the gravesite, with the body. So again, everything's within measure, but the idea here is that it does render impure. A Kohen is supposed to go out of their way to not become impure, and again, that's practiced even to this very day. Mark, thank you for sharing that anecdote. Very cool. Ray?
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that Kohanim go out of their way not to take El Al to Israel because El Al is known to carry dead bodies?
It's possible. I've heard that before. I don't have first-hand knowledge of that. I haven't confirmed it, but I've heard that anecdotally before, that some Kohanim will rather prefer to fly on another airline because when people are buried in Israel, they typically put the body on El Al, and the Kohen wants to avoid being in that space with the corpse. Yeah, it sounds like it makes sense. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that also. Okay, now let's take a look back at the opening verse and I still have it highlighted over here. I'll highlight it once again. Okay, it says, "Speak to the Kohanim and say to them," which is a double expression. If you look in the Hebrew, so it says, "Emor El HaKohanim," speak to the Kohanim, "V'amarta lahem," and say to them. It's just say. The Torah should just say, tell the Kohanim this, or speak to the Kohanim thusly. Why does it say, speak to the Kohanim and say to them? Rashi tells us something incredible. Rashi in his commentary tells us that what the message of God is to Moses is when you speak to the Kohanim, you're going to be speaking to the adults, right? Because, I mean, who are you going to give the instruction to? You're going to tell this mitzvah of personal sanctity, you're going to tell it to the adults who can understand the message. But then the Kohanim in turn tell the Kohanim when you speak to them that they should say to them, they should tell their kids about this. Emor v'amarta, why does it say tell and tell, or speak and speak? Because you're telling the adults to in turn tell the children. It's a double expression of communication, because you're not just telling one generation. You're telling this generation and telling them as well, tell your kids. This is how education happens. Education doesn't happen haphazardly. Education doesn't happen, oh, I remembered to tell a child or a student or whatever, and they got the information. Or I totally didn't tell them, but they'll pick up on it anyway. That's not how education happens. The Torah is telling us that education happens in a very deliberate, intentional, designed fashion. How do we ensure that the next generation, Kohen, knows at all about these laws? How do we ensure that in the year 5780, a full 3,300 years ago, after this communication was first given to Moses, that you still have Kohanim who will take the driveway in Mount Zion Cemetery in Chattanooga and who won't take El Al to Israel? Why is that still happening? Emor v'amarta, because whenever we taught anyone, we told them, teach it to your kids as well. Keep the chain going. Keep the legacy going. Pass the baton. Don't let it end with you. This is how we educate. We don't educate just the next generation. We educate the next generation to be the educators of the next generation. In other words, keep it moving forward. It's not about affecting the next one. It's affecting them in a way that they in turn influence the following generation as well. There's another beautiful, and you'll see this, I'm going to reveal, the big reveal, Rashi's commentary. Here we go. Look at this first Rashi right here. Say, you shall say. This double expression comes to admonish the adult Kohanim to be responsible for the minors, that they must not contaminate them. In other words, it's the adults who are responsible for the children. So not only should the adults watch out for themselves, but they should also make sure the children are okay and teach them the importance of being careful to not come in contact with ritual defilement. But if you look at the Hebrew, this is why I wanted to open up Rashi. If you look at the Hebrew, Rashi says, lahazhir gedolim al haktanim, to warn or to preempt the elders on the youth. In other words, to make sure they're being proactive about education. But the word that Rashi uses is lahazhir. There's another word that lahazhir is related to, and I just highlighted the text. Zahir. Zohar. We know Zohar is the primary work of Kabbalah. But what does the word mean in Hebrew? Lahazhir, Zahir, Zohar. It means to shine, or to be radiant, to be luminescent, to be glowing. So when you look at this deeper, the Hasidic masters explain this Rashi on a deeper level. Not just is Rashi telling us, is Rashi explaining that the verse is teaching us the importance of the parents teaching the children, but how that's done. How does a parent teach a child? By being a shining example. Yes, I mentioned before, it can't just happen. We can't just rely on osmosis. We have to be intentional. We have to be proactive. We have to be mindful about education and about those lessons. But at the same time, it's not what we say, it's who we are. And I want to share an anecdote along those lines. I once heard, in the name of a big educator, Jewish educator here in the United States, maybe a principal of a school or the headmaster of a Jewish day school, who said that parents will spend tens of thousands of dollars on a private Jewish education, and one trip to Disneyland, to Disney World, destroy the whole thing. Why? Yeah, because when they go to Disney World and they tell the child, oh, listen, the youth rate is up to kids that are age 11. You're 12, but we're going to pretend that you're 11 to get the $20 off the ticket. Yeah? So that, in one moment, can destroy an entire lifetime of Jewish education. Because the teachers can teach from today to tomorrow about the value of honesty and integrity and saying the truth and not being dishonest. And parents can tell their children the same thing. But when push comes to shove, when there's money on the line, and the parent says to the child, today you're 11 because we're getting a discount, yeah? So that undoes the whole thing. And that is the deeper meaning of lahazir. You have to be a shining example. You can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. You have to radiate the values that you're trying to instill in the next generation. If you're just telling them what to do, but you're not living it, then it's an empty message and it's not going to be impactful. The whole objective is that it should make a difference, that it should be impactful, that it should resonate, that it should change, create change. That only happens when you radiate that. I'll tell you another story. There was a Maggid. You know what a Maggid is? A Maggid was a traveling, I guess we would call it preacher. I don't know. That has a different connotation. Whatever. But a Maggid, a traveling like rabbinic order, who would go around. They would actually go around to speak. Back in the old country, they would be paid to visit a town and to speak and to give whatever message the local community, the rabbinic leaders, whatever, wanted to deliver. So that was their job, or that was their business. So there was one time a Maggid, one of these traveling rabbis, went to a certain town, and the rabbi told him that the theme of the talk should be the idea of giving tzedakah, of giving charity. And this man gets up and he speaks and he tells people how important it is to give tzedakah and how it's necessary and important and part of the fabric of Jewish life and all the whole pitch. And then they did an appeal, and it raised some money, but not a lot. And afterwards, another local rabbi got up, not the rabbi, but another local individual got up, and he also gave a very impassioned plea for tzedakah, and from that plea, many, many more people gave. And so the traveling rabbi said to the other rabbi, so tell me, why do you think people responded to your message more than mine? So the second rabbi smiled and he said, look, you do this for the money, right? You hire yourself out for the money. And you want the money. That's why you're doing it. So people sense the energy they get from you is you're holding on to the money, or you want to get the money. So when they hear you speak, your energy of wanting money is also kind of rubbing off on them, and they also, what do they want to do? They also want to hold on to their money. So in other words, the energy that you put out, which is I want the money, is the energy that they receive, which is I want the money also, and I'm going to hold on to my money. He says, but I don't really care about the money. I don't do this for the money, and it's really about the cause. So when I give a message, it wasn't in an arrogant way, but he was just explaining, the energy that I'm giving off it's not about the money, and people are more able to part with their money or to feel generous in giving because I'm exuding that generous energy. This is just an illustration. Again, it's not necessarily the words that we say, but also the lahazir, also the radiance, the aura, the energy, the emotion that we put out that makes a big impact on the other, whether it's a child, a grandchild, a student, a friend, a coworker. If we're trying to influence someone, we have to be intentional about it, but it's also about who we are. Who we are goes a long way in determining how impactful our message is. Okay, so that is the second point that I wanted to share. Let's look at hold on. Okay. All right, let's go to the second reading. let's go to the second reading. And I want to share one more idea for today. That's toward the end of the reading. Let's find it. It's all about at least the opening part is all about the personal sanctity of the Kohen and making sure that the Kohen is doing his part to remain on that level of priesthood. Okay, take a look at, what do I have here? Chat. Why does Rashi say Hazer Gedolim? Yeah, Lahazir Gedolim, yeah. Lahazir Gedolim al Katanim. That the elders should warn the young. In other words, they should educate them about being careful to not become ritually defiled. Okay, here we go. Let's find here, verse number 9. All right, the context of verse number 9 is about the Kohanim, about what they can touch, what they can eat. All right. But this one line right here, I'm going to first highlight it in the Hebrew. Verse 9, verse 10. It says, V'shamru es mishmarti. V'shamru es mishmarti. There's a double expression, again, another double expression, shamru and mishmarti. If you look at the letters, guard. So, V'shamru es mishmarti is God saying, watch my watches. Not like a timepiece, but guard my guardians or observances. So in this translation, in verse 9 of the English, it says, and they shall keep my charge. Okay, they shall keep my charge. All right, I hear that. It's not so literal, but that's kind of the general energy that we get. God is saying, keep the commandment. But if you look at the literal Hebrew, v'shamru es mishmarti means watch the things that I am watching, or guard the things that I have guarded. In other words, I have created guidelines, in order for you to stay in a good place. As a human being, God says, I'm creating boundaries for healthy living. So I'm saying, don't go there, don't eat that thing, don't touch that thing, don't head into that sort of activity. Why? Because it's not good for you. I'm your creator. I've tuned your body. I know your soul and your body and your mind and your heart. I know everything. And I'm telling you what's good for you is to do this and not to do that. So God says, these are areas that I've safeguarded for your own sake. Be careful with them. But the word is v'shamru es mishmarti. Guard God's safeguards, which becomes, listen to this becomes the origin for the notion of rabbinic legislation. Here we go. By the way, this is not the only source in Torah, in the written Torah. There are other sources, but this is very important. This is one of the very important sources for the notion of rabbinic legislation, where the rabbis will come in and say, look, the Torah allows it, but we are going to prohibit it. Why? Because we think that if people are going to engage in this behavior, even though technically it's okay, we believe that soon, they're going to get to the point where they violate the actual biblical law. This is what we call putting a fence around Torah. See, Torah itself is a fence around what is right and what is holy. In other words, it kind of creates those safeguards that we can live a good and elevated life. But the Torah says, V'shamru es mishmarti, which means guard the things that I've set up to guard you, which means that we are not only allowed to, but also empowered to, in the right context, of course, not just willy-nilly, but in the right context, to actually create additional legislation that is rabbinic of origin, or rabbinic in origin, in order to protect and safeguard the Torah itself. So, for example, let me give you one powerful example. This is a very interesting example. In the books of the prophets, we read a very, very troubling story. We read a story about how there was a young woman who, there was a man who took a liking to her. Well, maybe liking sounds too nice. He became obsessed with her. And he arranged things where they would be the only two people alone in a house together, and he proceeded to assault her and to rape her. It's a very troubling story, especially considering that they were somewhat related, even like half siblings or whatever. Very troubling story, and there were severe repercussions. Now, this actually happened with King David's offspring, some of King David's offsprings. And so King David, and in the aftermath of this, King David and his rabbinical court made a new takana, a new decree. And what was the new legislation? Rabbinic legislation, very transparent. It's not like a new law of Torah, but it's a law that's now binding because it was accepted by the Bet Din, by the court. And the new law is, or was, that a man and a woman who are not married should not be alone in a secluded place, out of concern that something might transpire, that something might happen. And again, the original context was an assault on this young woman. So essentially, in order to protect women and to ensure that this thing should not happen, there arose the decree of, that we call today, the prohibition of yichud. Yichud means the idea of being alone together. I'm sure I don't have to mention how even in 2020, maybe especially in 2020, we can see the concern, right, that led to this takana, that led to this Jewish legislation, rabbinic legislation, and we could see how this might perhaps, alleviate it. I would say that this has evolved to the point where it's not only not being alone with the other, but as maybe it's happened with you, where with Chabad rabbis and other rabbis, certainly Orthodox rabbis, where they'll make sure, and Rebbitzins as well, to not touch a member of the opposite gender that they're not either closely related to or married to. And it's all for the same thing, the idea that we're putting boundaries and making sure that no one is crossing those boundaries. So even though the actual boundary, the Torah boundary, is way beyond a handshake or even a hug or being alone in the same space, obviously, right? I don't have to say what that boundary is actually, but rabbinically, the rabbi said, in order to v'shamru es mishmarti, to protect God's safeguards and to ensure that we don't get there, which would be the violation, let's actually put a fence a little bit further back. Not at the edge of the cliff, and say you can go all the way up to there, but don't go past that line. That might be a little bit too hard. Once you get up to that point, it might be too difficult to pull back. So Torah allows for the rabbis to say, let's put the fence a little bit back. Now, you might be wondering, so who are these rabbis, and under what context, what circumstance? It's not a simple it's not a simple conversation. When I say simple conversation, it's not a quick answer. But I'll give you a few pointers. Number one, the rabbinic court that makes these decrees has to be a well-accepted rabbinic court, and this decree has to be accepted by the vast majority of the people of that time. In other words, the rabbis can't go ahead and make their own decree that the people aren't on board with. That's not a binding takana. Takana means a rabbinic enactment. In order for that rabbinic enactment to actually have weight in Jewish law, it has to have been accepted at that point by the vast majority of the people at that time, recognizing the need for that enactment. Similarly, the Torah allows polygamy. And the rabbis said, or one rabbi specifically in his rabbinic court 1,000 years ago plus said, no polygamy. We're not doing that. So rabbis have the ability, when they sense a danger to the integrity of Torah and Jewish law, to enact decrees or enactments, legislation, in order to keep people away from violating that. No different than in any country, where you might have a core constitution, which is like the core law, but then you would have other laws that are passed, and that evolve over the generations, over the years, when the need arises. So maybe this thing wasn't a problem before, but now we're seeing it's a problem. We're going to have to do something about it and create some legislation. So where does this permission come from in Torah? This is one of the verses, verse 9. That's what I'm saying. Even though in the context it's very specific to the Kohen, whatever, but there's a general message here, V'shamru es mishmarti, that the rabbis are allowed to safeguard God's safeguards by adding further rabbinic legislation. Mark Sanhedrin says the verse could have said merely they should not sin. Instead, this usage means they shall not bear sin over it. Okay, good. Okay, so that's it for those are the ideas that I wanted to share. I want to recap. Yeah, so Mark is asking in the chat, according to the Talmud's understanding of this verse, does that allow for additional legislation? The answer is yes. In fact, everything that I've told you now is well described in the Talmud about the rabbinic legislation. So let's recap. Oh, sorry. And the message for us in our lives. Let's get a personal message from this. Okay, there are things that we know are not okay, but then there are times in our lives that we realize that we're becoming, maybe we have a weakness for something, right? Maybe we're tripping up in a certain area, and then we have to take a step back. And this is an important thing to do, to assess ourselves, to assess our weaknesses, and not tempt ourselves too much. Don't put ourselves in a situation where we're super tempted and we may make a mistake. We may succumb to that temptation, whatever it is. This could be a health, an eating related conversation. It could be when it comes to interpersonal relationships. It could be when it comes to romantic considerations, like I mentioned before. It could be in any area in life, right? It could be with substance, alcohol, etc. When we sense that there's an area in which we are, struggling with, let's take a step back. Let's create a fence and make sure that it doesn't become indeed a problem or a bigger problem than it already is. This is not only a message with regards to the construct of Jewish law, but also a message for how we are to construct our own lives. So in short, let's recap the few lessons that we had today and close it out. Number one, we spoke about the idea of personal sanctity for the Kohanim, about how they are encouraged and commanded by Torah to not become defiled. And again, it's not a bad thing. It's just, as I mentioned a week or two ago, it's a reality. Coming into contact with death renders one impure. So the Torah encourages a Kohen whose whole role is purity and holiness to not become impure by coming in contact with a dead body, with the exception of a very close relative. We talked about how even to this very day, Kohanim, those that come from the family of Kohanim, are very careful not to become ritually impure in that way. We spoke about the importance of intentional education, intentionally not just teaching your children, but teaching them that they should also pass it forward and pay it forward to their own children, their own students, and keep the legacy going, keep the tradition moving forward. We spoke about the ideal way of education, which is not just teaching it or speaking it, but it's rather emulating that behavior or modeling the behavior. Children and other individuals learn more by who we are than what we say. The last point we talked about was the Torah's allowance and encouragement to create fences around the Torah itself through rabbinic legislation and rabbinic enactments. And we spoke about emulating this in our own lives by creating safeguards for ourselves, recognizing where our weaknesses are, and putting up fences, putting up guards to make sure we don't succumb to those weaknesses. All right, that's all I have for today. We're open for questions, discussions, conversations, announcements, whatever. The floor is yours. Please unmute yourselves and speak freely.